All right, so I hope people can see us. Let me just double check. All right, perfect. Good, we're on. Awesome. People, hello and welcome to this talk at the Java Champions Conference. Super excited to be here with Matt Rabel. I'm Gunnar Molling. I have the honor to host this session. So I hope you had a great Java Champions Conference so far. I know Matt has, I believe, like 10 or 15 slides to introduce himself, so I don't need to say an awful lot about him. I'm super excited about this talk where we're going to learn about different ways for building native REST APIs using Java and different frameworks like Quarkus, Spring Boot, all this kind of good stuff. And the one thing I want to say is if you have questions, please put them to the chat, and then Matt will take them at the end. So there will be plenty of time then. We don't have to, finish this at the top of the hour. With that, I'm going off screen, and Matt, take it away.
Thank you. So welcome to Native Java REST API Comparison. My name is Matt Rabel. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity and no running water. I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day. But in the winter, we got to ski, so that was a lot of fun. I live in Denver, Colorado with my beautiful wife, Trish, my awesome kids, Abby and Jack. And you can tell this picture is a bit dated because Jack is now the tallest one in the family by a good 6 inches. So we need to shoot a new one of that. I also have a middle child. His name is Hefe. I bought him off eBay in 2004, and it took 12 years to make him look like this. He's got a Porsche engine, Porsche transmission, and he's super fun to drive. I also got tired of waiting that 12 years for him to be done, so I bought another Syncro Vanagon in the meantime. And so if you have a similar problem with classic Volkswagens, I'd love to talk to you after because it's certainly a fun hobby of mine. I work for a company called Okta. My dad called it Okra for the first 2 years, so he's graduated now to Okta. He's not quite at Okta yet, but challenge with parents. We bought our biggest competitor about 3 years ago called Auth0. And when Okta joined Auth0, I remember going and looking at their website and looking at their leadership team, and Eugenio Pace was their CEO. And in his bio, it said in his spare time, he enjoys the outdoors, rowing, riding bikes, spending time with his family, and restoring his 1970 Karmann Ghia. So that is another classic Volkswagen, and I knew we'd be best friends, and it'd be a great match since then. So in my first 5 years at Okta, I worked in the Okta developer relations team, and for the last couple of years, I've worked in the Auth0 developer relations team. So it's all one big company, but the Auth0 brand is so prominent that we kept that. So today we're going to talk about Java, why you should use it, how to build APIs with Java, both REST and GraphQL, and then how to secure your APIs with OAuth 2.1. And then I'll show you how to build them with Docker, and finally how to go native with GraalVM. And at the end, there'll be some fun comparisons in the community metrics between the different frameworks, as well as startup time and memory performance. And so Java's been around for 25 years. It's had a lot of use, abuse, and improvements. The biggest myth that a lot of people have, probably not you as Java developers, because you know this, is you might need to buy a license from Oracle to run it in production. Well, first of all, Oracle's JDK is not the only JDK. There's many JDKs out there. And yes, if you're making $1 million a month off your app that runs in production, you should probably buy support from someone. It doesn't have to be Oracle. There's many other providers out there, but I want to dispel that myth that yes, you can run Java free in production. So it's open source. Code is available in OpenJDK, and there's many popular open source frameworks and tools. And it's used by many companies that you've probably heard of: Netflix, eBay, IBM, Microsoft, Okta, VMware, Apple, and Tesla. So to get started with Java 21, you can download the Oracle JDK from OpenJDK at jdk.java.net, or you can get the Eclipse builds from Adoptium. But what I recommend is SDKman. If you're not familiar with SDKman, you're getting your money's worth just from this one slide, because it's one of the coolest tools that you can use in a Java environment. It allows you to switch between JDKs. It allows you to install Maven, allows you to install Gradle, allows you to install the CLIs from Micronaut, Spring Boot, Quarkus, and even Helidon. And so you can see SDK install Java will get you the latest version of 21, and that's pretty slick. And Java 21 represents the 12th feature release as part of the 6-month cadence that we've had in Java land. And for over 6 years, this cadence has basically helped developers manage their adoption of innovation thanks to a steady stream of incremental and expected changes. Thanks to Sharath from Oracle for this slide. And one of the things I really like is when people talk about, the Java rapid releases, is you can think of it as a train. You can get on the Java 21 train if you want, or you can wait till Java 22 or even Java 23. In 6 months, you'll probably, want to consider it, but you don't have to. The biggest thing you probably want to do is get off Java 8, at least to Java 11. What I like with a lot of the frameworks that I'm talking about today is their latest versions typically require Java 17, and Helidon even requires Java 21. Oops, wrong way. So this talk was originally based or inspired by a blog post by Daniel Porida on the Okta developer blog. You can see the date on there right before COVID hit, right, in 2020. And it talked about developing services in Java, including REST APIs. And it wasn't always easy until Spring came along and kind of changed the landscape. And many years have passed since then, and new frameworks have emerged. So, we have Micronaut, which was started by OCI, the same company behind Grails. And their goal is to help developers create microservices and serverless applications. Oops. What did I do? I messed it up. All right. And then there's also Quarkus, another framework that gained popularity over a couple of years, developed by Red Hat. Quarkus promises to deliver fast startup time and less memory usage, two common problems when developing REST services. So when I first, promoted this blog post after Daniel wrote it, it really got a lot of people interested. Now, it wasn't people from the frameworks themselves because, they don't like to see one compared to the other. It was the developers that are like, oh, that's very insightful. I know Spring Boot. I didn't know it was so easy to use Quarkus or something like that. And then I wrote another framework or post based on the previous one that showed you how to build native Java REST APIs. So that was using GraalVM. And since I had tinkered with GraalVM for the prior year, this is funny because it was one of those blog posts that kind of blew up. You can see the date there is June 2021. Very popular. And it didn't take me more than 2 hours to write because I'd already done all the research. So keep that in mind when you're writing blog posts that, maybe something you already know is very easy to write about. And then I got contacted from the Helidon folks of Oracle. And they were like, it'd be really cool if you included Helidon in your comparison. And I was like, well, be careful what you ask for. Like in the past, I've done these comparisons of Java web frameworks. And usually when I haven't added you, it's because you're not that popular. And my presentation is going to kind of show that. So it's been an interesting experiment. And I'm glad they did ask me to include it because I've learned a lot about being involved with the Helidon community and how they work. So, I wrote this blog post on just how to do it with Helidon. And you might be wondering, well, what is the point of doing native apps with Java? Well, a lot of times it's about startup time. And serverless often is just someone else's computers, right? But the startup time on serverless is very crucial. And you can't get around that startup time by leaving your JVMs warm because then you're not serverless, right? And so a lot of Java apps actually are warm. They use a JVM and they aren't shut down and started up each day unless they have a memory leak. Yeah, that's how we used to fix it back in the day with Tomcat. But what happens with big companies is they can save a lot of money with serverless. And it's because maybe they spend $1 million a month. Maybe they spend $1 million a day on their Java apps in production. And if they can save on that memory usage and that CPU time when they're not running, then serverless is a big deal. And when you're big, you don't want money flying out the window. So I really like this graphic that Dan Vega created on use cases for native images. The JVM is likely better in most cases when you have a high traffic website and you're not trying to scale to 0 and then back up to 100 or 1,000 or whatever it may be. Huge memory and CPU, frequent deployments, all those things on the top there. Maybe consider it for microservices, and then recommend it if you have low memory and CPU usage because you can get away with 50 megs in one of these native apps. And the serverless, that's the functions as a server and scale to 0. So that's kind of the niche I'm talking about. And the cool thing about all these apps that I'm going to show you today is they will work on the JVM, right? You can start them with java-jar, but you can also compile them to native and then have them run as a native executable on your operating system. So to get started with Micronaut, you can use SDKman and install the Micronaut CLI, and then you could use mn create app, specify a package name. That last part will be your app name, and then the features. In this case, what I'm going to build is just a simple hello world app that returns the user's what they call a sub from a JWT. So I'm going to use JWT authentication, and in OAuth terms, this is called a resource server. There's no way to, in essence, log into this resource server except to pass it a JWT, which we will get using another mechanism. And so, it is secure. It does require authentication, but it's not really authentication, it's authorization, right? Because for me to get that access token, I had to authenticate somewhere else. And then I'm just passing in that I have the permission to access that resource. If you're more of a visual person, you can use Micronaut Launch at micronaut.io/launch. You can see here, it defaults to Gradle Kotlin. Of all of these frameworks, a lot of them have switched, or the most notable one is Spring Boot has switched from Maven to Gradle as the default. This is the only one that uses Gradle Kotlin as a default. And I believe that switch was with Micronaut 4. So that was new in the last 6 months or so. And you can see all the rest is the same things that I had in the previous command. And then to create a hello controller that returns the person's sub from a JWT or their username or whatever it might be from your identity provider, you can see here what it looks like. There's a lot of imports from Micronaut itself, and then the Java security principle, a few annotations to say it's a GET request and it's secured and it returns plain text. And then for Micronaut JWT security, you need to enable security, which is enabled by default, and JWT, and then provide a URL to the public keys that can be used to verify the signatures on JWTs. And so that JSON web key set contains the public keys that can verify the signatures of the tokens, and the keys will allow you to validate the JWT locally. You don't need to make another call out to the authorization server to validate them. And so, if you're not familiar with the JWT, there's a header, claims, and a signature, and the RFC 6750 bearer token specification defines how those JWTs are transmitted. And so then you've built this app. How do you test it? I like to use HTTPie, which sometimes I call HTTPIE because, I don't know, it's hard for me to pronounce. It's a better curl. It sends application JSON as a content type by default. And I've got a little animated GIF here that kind of shows you how it works. So you just specify HTTP or HTTPS, and then a URL. You can see it's got nice colors. You can do put, specify, parameters and values, and you can do the 418 and get I'm a teapot. So pretty cool tool. Highly recommend it. So to test this Micronaut app I just showed you the code for, you can run Gradle run, and then you can hit it with HTTP. That will give you a 401, and then you specify the access token that you got somewhere else, and then you pass that in an authorization header and specify that it's a bearer token. And so if you're doing basic authentication, it looks very similar to that last line, except you will say basic, and then it's a username :password that's base64 encoded. And guess what? A JWT is the same thing. It's a base64 encoded JSON document. And if you decode it, well, then you can see all its content. So it's not encrypted in that sense. And so just to show you, to prove that I actually did this and it worked, you can see the first call there to 401 and then specifying the token. And the second one gives you back the sub from the JWT. In this case, it's auth0 pipe and then a random string of characters. And you could store this as your user ID in your database if you wanted to have some sort of linking involved there. And if you were to use a different mechanism to log in and get that access token, for instance, Google, it would actually be a bit different. It would be Google-OAuth2 pipe and then the string. And so that's just an auth0 thing. I know if you use Okta and their workforce identity to do something similar, it just gives you an email. So it can be different based on your providers. And then if you want to have a way to link, username and password versus login with Google, Auth0 does provide that where you can have an action that actually combines them, so you're not dealing with two different subs there. And moving on to Quarkus, to install the Quarkus CLI, you do SDK install Quarkus, and then you can use the Quarkus create command, specify your app, or create app as the actual command, specify your package and the name of your app. The extensions are SmallRye JWT, just to do the resource server JWT authorization, and REST Easy Reactive. And then in these examples, I decided to use Gradle for everything. It used to be that I would use Maven for all four, but with Spring Boot and Micronaut defaulting to Gradle, I just figured it'd be easy enough to use Gradle for all of them. And you might be confused on the REST Easy Reactive. You're like, why reactive? We're not developing a reactive app. Well, I've talked to the Quarkus folks many, many times about this, and this is their recommendation whether you're developing a reactive app or not. So there is a REST Easy Classic, and the reason that you would want to use that is if you're deploying it in an app server like WebSphere. And if you are, I'm sorry. So REST Easy Reactive for everything else. You can also use a Maven archetype. So this is a long and complicated command that's probably difficult to memorize. So don't recommend it. The previous command is much easier, but you can use it if you want. And then, of course, if you like visual and you like a browser-based experience, you can go to code.quarkus.io and specify your group, your artifact, your build tool, and all that other stuff right there. And then all your features or selected extensions that you might want. And then for Quarkus, it's a bit different than Micronaut. You'll notice all the Jakarta imports. That's because Quarkus supports MicroProfile, and that's JAX-RS as part of MicroProfile. And so most of the annotations are standard part of Java, or Java EE or Jakarta EE, and then you have the authenticated one from Quarkus. Otherwise, it looks very similar to Micronaut. It's got 3 annotations on the hello method. It gets the user principal, grabs the name. And so MicroProfile has a JWT security spec. And the interesting thing is they don't really call it OAuth, even though it is OAuth. They call it JWT. So they make you specify 2 things, an issuer and a public key location. And this is somewhat frustrating to me as like an OAuth person, that they require both. Because guess what? If you go to the issuer, you can get the JWKS URI. So they could just have one and look up the other. And so what I've learned is that Quarkus has an OIDC extension that allows you to do this. If you're using the JWT SmallRye extension, you have to specify them both because that's a MicroProfile thing. And I do believe they're probably doing it for optimization, right? Because they don't want to actually call out to the issuer to get the JWKS URI if they don't have to. So to test Quarkus with HTTP-IE, you can start it with Gradle, hit it like we did before, and pass in that bearer token. To show you it works, here's a 401 when we first did it without that bearer token. When we use the token, it succeeds as expected. And to get started with Spring Boot, the first way that I've done it for most of my career is using start.spring.io. But rather than using the actual website, I've used HTTP-IE. And so if you hit starter.tgz as the endpoint there, you can pass in the dependencies. You can see we're doing Spring MVC as the web one, the OAuth 2 resource servers for setting up the JWT authorization, and then native is for GraalVM. So you might have noticed with Micronaut and Quarkus, we didn't need to specify native or any native extension. And so they have it built in versus Spring Boot has this small extension that you need to add. And if you already have a POM file or a Grail build.gradle file, you can easily add it to it, but it doesn't come by default. Package name, app name. The reason I'm using Spring Boot 3.2.0 here is because there is an issue with 3.2.1 and 3.2.2 and web and security and GraalVM. So if you're developing a Spring MVC app with Spring Security and you want to compile it to native, use Spring 3.2.0. And if you were to go to start.spring.io and try to select 3.2.0, it doesn't work. So that's why I recommend, using a command like this where you can specify the version, or even using the Spring Boot CLI. So you can do SDK install Spring Boot, And then you can use the Spring init command, pass in those parameters, specify the group ID, specify the version, that's a -B there, and then the package name. So as far as I know, it will be fixed. I don't know if it's Spring Boot 3.3.3, but it's based on Spring Security. That's where the bug is. And they've said on the issue that I've talked to people about that it will be fixed on February 19th. So they don't benefit, or Spring Boot doesn't benefit from having the latest version of this comparison because there's a bug in Spring Security and GraalVM. But they do have the least amount of code required to do that hello endpoint. You can see just a couple imports from Spring, one for Java Security Principle, and only one annotation on the class and one annotation on the actual method. So they win for the longest package name contest, but also they win the least lines of code. And at Okta, we do have an Okta Spring Boot starter that makes it even easier than using what Spring provides. And that is because we wrap the Spring security dependencies. And so it's just a thin wrapper. The only major difference is we do audience validation as well. So that's optional, but it is recommended. And the thing I like about it is look at that property name, okta.oauth2 issuer. You can memorize that. The one from Spring Security is spring.security.oauth2.resourceserver.jwt.issuer-URI. I've tried to memorize it for the last 5 years. Haven't been able to. So, if you're using code completion and IntelliJ, maybe, but I haven't been able to. So I like using Okta Spring Boot Starter. It works with Auth0. It works with Okta. It even works with Keycloak. The difference is when you're using Keycloak, you have to use those spring.security.oauth2 property names, because if you use the Okta ones, we do validation on the URL to make sure it's an Okta property. So to test Spring Boot with HTTPie, same as the others, start it up, hit it, get a 401, pass in the token, and then everything will work. So the major difference between Spring and Spring Security and the other frameworks so far is that look at all those security headers. None of the other ones, like we turned any security headers, and we have 10 or 15 here. So Spring Security has been around for a lot longer. If you trace it back to a CG Security, it's going on maybe 19 years or so. And so it's pretty impressive that they have those in there. And if you verify it and specify that token, you'll see it all works and you still get all those security headers. So moving on to Helidon, you can see you can use an archetype just like you can with Quarkus, but good luck memorizing it, right? That's a pretty long command. It does work. You can also go to helidon.io/starter. And the interesting thing here was this command for Maven works with 404, but notice up in the top right corner it says 402. So maybe this is a bit lagging versus when the artifacts are there, they're there for Maven. And if you want to create an MP, which stands for microprofile, you select that. SE is more of like the reactive style. And I will be doing a presentation next week at JFocus that compares and adds reactive versions of these frameworks to this presentation. So watch out for that. You'll be able to watch it on YouTube if you want. You can also use the Helidon CLI. So this has only been added to SDKman in the last 6 months. I'm very happy that it has been added because it's nice to have consistency between all the frameworks. You can use a Helidon init command, pass in the flavor, and then group ID, artifact ID, and package name. And then the class for that hello endpoint looks kind of similar to the Quarkus one because Helidon supports microprofile as well. So you've got the Helidon imports, you've got a bunch of JAX-RS imports, and then the path authenticated. A little bit simpler, not too bad, but it does require an extra class to register that hello resource. So a lot of the other ones, you can just add a single endpoint, everything works. With Helidon, and whether you're using MP or SE, it does require you to register it. So a little bit more work, but not too bad. And then you do have to add a dependency. So with Spring Boot, Quarkus, and Micronaut, we could specify either a feature, an extension, or a dependency, and it would add it. With Helidon, you can't. So you have to add the microprofile JWT auth dependency, and then just like Quarkus, the properties, right? 2 of them. You can specify the second one or the first one in the second one, like I did here, to show you don't have to, repeat the same information in both properties. And so that goes into source main resources metainf microprofile-config.properties. And then to test it, unlike the others, you do have to package your Helidon app if you're just using Java. If you're using the CLI, there is a Helidon dev command you can use. But if you're just using Java, you can't run a Gradle command or a Maven command to start it up. You have to package it and then run java-jar. So it's a little jarring, right? And then you'll get a 401 passing that token, and everything will work. Again, not many, security headers here like Spring Security had, but everything works as expected. And so now I like to get into some startup performance. And I think this is actually one of the least important things, because what I'm showing here is your dev startup. This is you typing in Gradle run and Micronaut, or, Gradle boot run and Spring Boot, and it just starting and showing it, right? And I used Helidon dev for the Helidon part. But you can see, everything starts pretty fast, 368 for Micronaut. These are milliseconds, so under a half a second. But whoa, look at Quarkus, right? It's like 1.3 seconds. The difference with Quarkus is you don't need to restart it as much. It has, like, similar to Spring Boot DevTools, it has its own DevTools, but it's actually like part of the framework. You don't have to add an extra dependency for it. And it will see if you've changed properties files, Java files, whatever files, and basically, reload that file and reload the app. And it does it very quick. So with Quarkus, chances are you only need to actually run it once a day, and you never need to restart it because their, slick dev tools will do it for you. With the other ones, Helidon dev will actually reload as well, and Spring Boot has dev tools which will reload. But the experience for me with Quarkus has been the best. And so, the rest you can see if you're just doing java-jar, it's going to start in, under a second or half a second for, Micronaut Quarkus. But the reason you want it to start in like 10 or 50 milliseconds or stuff like that is because Python and Node can do that, right? And so if we're competing in a serverless environment against those frameworks, those languages, like, it's got to be fast. And a half a second is way too slow in a serverless environment. And it's funny, when I first started doing this presentation, what I noticed was both Spring Security and Helidon would actually, in this scenario where we have an OAuth configured issuer, they would call out to the issuer or to the JWKS endpoint and get those on startup. And I was able to convince them, just from doing this comparison, that they should do it on first request. And the reason was because Micronaut and Quarkus were doing it that way. And if they wanted to compete with them in a serverless environment, guess what? You got to be doing the same thing that they do. And so you don't want to impede your startup time, maybe your first request time, but after that, everything should be good. So you might be asking, what about GraphQL APIs? We saw how to develop REST APIs. Well, all of them have GraphQL support. Micronaut has it. You can look at their guide there. Quarkus has it with small-i GraphQL. Spring Boot has it. And the cool thing about Spring Boot is that recently became an official project, probably in the last year and a half, maybe 2 years. But before, they had a few different, ancillary projects that had GraphQL support, and they adopted it and made it part of it. So, Helidon has it as well in version 4. And so I'm not going to go into how you build a GraphQL API with these frameworks, but chances are it's pretty easy. They have good documentation, and, it stays up to date. So now you might be wondering, what about OAuth and OAuth 2.1? Well, trying to understand OAuth often feels like being trapped inside a maze of specs, trying to find your way out before you can finally do what you set out to do, which is build your application. So the reason for OAuth 2.1 is to capture the current best practices in OAuth 2.0, as well as its well-established extensions under a single name. You can see all of these in this maze here. Some of them are related to JWT, some are related to the auth method, mutual TLS, and there's just a lot in there. And as a developer, you probably don't care, right? You just want to implement JWT authentication or authorization, or maybe, OpenID Connect login, right? And otherwise, who cares if it's OAuth compliant or not? So to secure your app with OAuth 2.1, there's a few things you can do to make sure you're more secure and just following the best practices. PXE is required for all clients using the authorization code flow, and the authorization code flow is the gold standard for the flow that you want to use. So PKCE stands for Proof Key for Code Exchange, and it's recommended, especially if you're doing SPAs, right, single page apps, or mobile apps, because you don't want to have a client secret in those. They can be reverse engineered. One of the greatest stories about this is the Twitter app actually had a client secret in it, and it was in the App Store. People downloaded it, reverse engineered it, and then they were able to act like Twitter against the API. So no client secrets in your SPAs or your mobile apps. Redirect URIs must be compared using exact string matching. And so a lot of times an identity provider will allow you to use wildcard. So you could do like a subdomain or a star.auth0.com, and anything that used, that trailing suffix would work. You want to use exact string matching, so it's more explicit that you expect it to redirect back to this app. The implicit grant is omitted. The implicit grant returns the access token in the address bar, which might show up in server logs. So OAuth 2.0 came out before cross-origin resource sharing existed in browsers. That's why they did that. But now you can make an XHR request and get it without doing that. The resource owner password credentials grant is omitted. This grant allows you to pass in a username and password. And if you're passing in a username and password, then why are you using OAuth, right? The whole point of OAuth is to do delegated authorization and to not pass in a username and password. You're just passing in a token. So if you ever read an OAuth tutorial that has a username and password and using the resource owner password grant, just close it. Don't bother reading it. It's way outdated. The only reason they added this was so you could pop a browser, or for an OS that couldn't pop a browser like Windows 3.1, you could still use OAuth. So getting rid of that, and then there's a couple other things there as well. And so I mentioned OpenID Connect, or OIDC. It's basically a thin layer on top of OAuth. What was happening is companies like Facebook and Google were using OAuth when you would log in, but they still wanted your identity. And OAuth 2.0 is not an authentication or identity framework. So OpenID Connect came about because what Google and Facebook were doing is they had a /me endpoint. And you pass your access token to that /me endpoint, and then you get user identity information. Well, they basically standardized it, so now there's a /user info endpoint, and you can do the same thing. So Micronaut supports OIDC. You can see they have a Auth0 tutorial for it. Quarkus does as well. Spring Boot has OIDC support. They call it OAuth 2 login, though. So if you've ever developed a Spring Security app, you'll see it's called OAuth 2 login, which is, I think, bad because you can't actually do login with OAuth. It only supports authorization. But they're talking to Rob Winch. He said they did it because GitHub didn't support OIDC, but they could still log in there. So whatever. It's still OIDC. And then Helidon has it as well. So what about testing? Well, a lot of times, who tests their code? No, we all do testing, right? You should do testing. These frameworks, particularly when you get into the GraalVM sort of thing, the ones that really stood out to me were Quarkus. Allows you to basically subclass your existing test. And in your new subclass test, you'll add an annotation called Quarkus integration test, and then it'll make that into a native test. So you can test to make sure everything's working in a native environment. And Spring Boot generates a native test library that's similar, where you can run it in a native environment. And you might be asking, like, if it works in the JVM, why wouldn't it work in native? Well, sometimes you have to enable flags. Like when I first started doing this stuff a few years ago, HTTPS had to be enabled. So as part of your GraalVM build, you had to say, like, enable HTTPS. And so when you're testing locally in the JVM, you wouldn't see that. But when you did the binary and ran it, it would error out because it didn't have HTTPS support enabled. So by having those tests, you can see that everything's working and everything's enabled. And so now moving on to building with Docker, all of them will allow you to use a Docker file, right? All of them will produce a jar. So you could have a Docker file that's as simple as this, where it just grabs it from your target directory or your build directory, copies it into the Docker container, exposes port 8080, and then runs it with java-jar. That will work for any of them. And you can build that with Docker build, specify the tag name, and you can run it with Docker run and expose those ports. But a better way to do it, I think, is to use Jib. And this is a project from Google. You can see the link at the bottom there on GitHub. and it will basically read your pom.xml or your build.gradle and produce a Docker container based on those settings. So you don't need to continually, tweak your Docker file. And so if you wanted to, you're using Java 22, like it would update and use that instead of Java 21, and you wouldn't have to update the Docker file. So you can see the commands to build it there, or you can build it directly to your Docker daemon locally, or you can build it directly to like Docker Hub or Google Container Registry. And so for the various frameworks, Micronaut uses Jib, but you must configure plugins. Quarkus generates 4 Docker-related files by default, and then Quarkus does have an extension that you can use Jib. Spring Boot 2.3 and above has built-in support, and so the Spring Boot build image command will build it in a Docker container. Why would you need that? Well, if you didn't want to install GraalVM. So that's one reason for it. You can see the Gradle command there as well. What I've noticed is I have an Apple Silicon M1, and if I build it with Gradle, it takes maybe a minute or two. If I do it with Docker, it takes like 5 or 6 minutes. So, choose your own poison. Like maybe in GitHub Actions, you want to use Docker, but locally, I don't want to wait extra minutes if I don't have to. It uses layered jars for faster builds. So as you build with Docker more and more, it should get faster. It starts with dependencies and snapshot dependencies, resources, applications. So in the order of most changing to least changing, and that's how it all works. And so Helidon doesn't have any Jib documentation out there, but it is something you just put in your pom.xml. So you could easily add Jib to a Helidon app's pom.xml and use MVN compile Jib Docker build. It also has 3 Docker files that it creates by default. So to go native with GraalVM and Micronaut, obviously you create the app with that create app command. You can package it, specify -d packaging equals native image. If you're using Maven, if you're using Gradle, you see those commands there. And then with Quarkus, commands are a little bit longer for the MVM package and the Gradle build, but it's all built in, right? We didn't have to add any other extensions to do this. And then you can build the image and run it. For Spring Boot, it does require the native Maven plugin and the Spring Boot Maven plugin. And so if you're using Gradle, it's a different one, Build Tools Native. And what I do is if I have a Spring Boot app that's existing and I want to go add native support, I'll just go to start.spring.io, add the native dependency, and then click on Explore. And then you can see what that build.gradle or that pom.xml looks like, copy and paste them into yours. And then you can use native compile if you're using native, or Gradle native compile. And then you can build an image with Docker as well, like I showed earlier. And then with Helidon, it doesn't have, those commands built in. So you just have to use a Docker file. So you can use Docker build and Docker run. Now for the fun part. We got like 20 minutes left. Hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. And I think even if this goes over, we'll have time for questions. So this was built with Java or GraalVM CE 21.0.2. So this is the latest version out there, unless they released one in the last hour that I don't know about. And what I did here is I basically built all the images and then I ran them and took the startup time that they printed to the console, right? So this is Micronaut saying I took 13.8 seconds to start up. Quarkus saying, I took 20 milliseconds to start up, and then I just took those numbers and put them here. So what I did was I ran each one 3 times before I recorded any numbers, and then I ran them 5 times and averaged them out. And sometimes there's like a weird anomaly in here that might be, my machine or whatever, where, it's 10 milliseconds higher for some reason. And, resource contention might make an excuse for that. But, over time, these, even when I do this every 3 months or whatever, they're similar in comparison. And I think the last time I did it, which was just 20 days ago on January 9th, Quarkus was faster. And the interesting thing is, since then, 20 days ago, Micronaut has had 1 update, 1 release. Quarkus has had 4. Helidon's had 2. And Spring Boot has had 1, but I can't use it because it doesn't work with GraalVM. So the optimized version for Micronaut is actually using ahead of time compiling. And this was added to my examples from the Micronaut team. So, I don't know much about it. They just added it and I'm using it. But you'll notice it's not actually faster. So that's interesting. Versus the Helidon optimized version, they removed OpenAPI. So when you create a brand new Helidon app, it has OpenAPI by default. I don't know if that's a good idea. Like if you're trying to make serverless, right? Why would you have that in there? So you can see the optimized version is faster when you remove that. But really, the best way to test the startup time is to script it, right? You should start it, ping localhost 8080 and see if it's running. And once it's running, that's the startup time. So my conclusion after doing that, this was recommended by the Quarkus folks, Max Anderson, is that the frameworks are filthy liars. Like, look at this. This is how fast they say they are. This is how fast they really are. And so if I look at it and I do a comparison of who's lying the most, it's the fastest one, Micronaut. The difference between their scripted startup time and their startup time that they say they are is 24.6 milliseconds. And then Quarkus is lying 22 milliseconds, Spring Boot 18.6, and Helidon 13.2. So as they get, less performant, they're lying less. But yeah, they're all kind of lying on that startup time. And, I think it's important to just, test them with scripted. And again, I'm running on an M1, right? Which isn't really great, right? Because I'm not testing what you might use in production. Now GitHub Actions, I did see, has M1 support today. So, maybe in the future, people will spend more on hardware and, get faster in production, but I doubt it. Everyone's going to run on Linux. So I decided I would test this on AWS. So when I first started doing this, I was like, well, I got to build it on AWS and then run it, right? Just like I am on my Mac. And so I started with T2 small, 1 CPU, 2 gigs RAM, couldn't build any of the projects. Started with the medium, Quarkus and Spring Boot, failed to build, Micronaut built, Helidon took too long, I gave up. And then with 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM, I was able to build everything. So typical Java, typical GraalVM, right? You need a lot of resources to build stuff. But then I realized, like, people aren't going to deploy the binaries, right? They're going to deploy Docker containers. So rather than, me spending the time to script everything and deploy it, I farmed it out to GitHub Actions. I was able to set up GraalVM and then build these projects and deploy them as native images in Docker to Docker Hub. And so you can see the URL at the bottom there that goes to my example repo and has that workflow to deploy all the various projects. And so with Docker testing startup performance on this AWS EC2 T2 Micro, you can see that Quarkus starts the fastest. And again, this is scripted, right? This is using a start-docker script that I got from the Micronaut project. And it basically, starts the container, pings 8080. Once it responds, it shuts it down. So you can see there that Micronaut, is not the fastest. Quarkus is, at least in production. And then Spring Boot and Helidon are not. And this is the first time in my recollection that Helidon has been faster than Spring Boot. The other thing I wanted to do is test the memory usage of each of these after 10 requests. And so when I first started doing this a few years ago, I would test the memory usage with no requests, on first request, and then after 5 requests. 5 requests, 10 requests probably doesn't matter. And what you see here is the memory usage after 10. So Quarkus still uses the least amount of memory after 10 requests. I've found issues with both, I think it was Micronaut and Helidon, where they were increasing the memory usage by 20 megs or so, maybe just 10, but on each request. And so, maybe that was up to a certain pool or whatever, 250 megs or something like that. But I reported the issues with both projects and they have fixed it. So that is another weird one of those that, why did this guy creating this presentation find this bug and you guys didn't? But you can see they're all, very optimal for their usage compared to regular Java apps that might take, half a gig to start up. And then testing Docker memory after the 10 requests. This is, again, a script that I created. It's in the example. This is on EC2 T2 Micro. You can see that Micronaut and Quarkus are very similar. They only use, 20 megs in a Docker container. And Spring Boot and Helidon, also very similar, about twice that, 40 megs. And so I do have this sample repo here, and I'll try to mirror my screens and get this right. And if I forget to unmirror, then we'll go back. Okay, that's the one's not going to work. We got to do it the other way. Okay, so now we got them mirrored. And if I pull this up in IntelliJ, you can see here's the project. And I built them all before we started, so this completed. I'm in Denver, and it was almost noon, or it was noon when we started, so this is 10 minutes before that. And if I was to go into, the Micronaut directory, this README has how to start each one. So these are the properties file that define the issuer for each one. And then Micronaut, you can start with Gradle run, but you're really interested in running them as a native executable, right? So if we start Micronaut here, it'll start up. It'll give me a warning because it's a native executable. But then if I was to open up a terminal, I could create an access token, auth0 test token, pass in an audience, pass in a scope. It'll prompt me to log in. I'll use the CLI login testing, proceed. And this is using OAuth as well. This is a device flow. And so then I can take that access token and I can set it as a variable. And then I can use HTTP to go to that token, and everything works. The other thing I can do that's in here is, I think it's still running back here, right? So I want to cancel that. But I have these several scripts. So if we look at the startup scripts, there's a build.sh, a memory docker, a memory sh, start docker, and start.sh. So if I do start.sh Micronaut, what it does is it starts it and then pings it on 8080. And so you can see here's the difference, right? Micronaut, I take 12 milliseconds to start up. No, you take 46. Try it again. I take 11. No, you take 48. So filthy liars they are. If we try it with Quarkus, it says it starts up in 102 or a second, right? A little over a second. But right here it says 23 milliseconds. We try it again, we get 41 milliseconds versus 13, 55 versus 15. So yeah, they're lying. They're not as fast as they say they are. Let's try it with Spring Boot. And you'll see here that took 1.4 seconds, 75 milliseconds, so quite a bit better. And that's why you have to run it, several times. I'm sure, doing StreamYard here is slowing things down as well. And then I'll show you Helidon. You can see 1.6 seconds, 69 milliseconds, 62 milliseconds. And then the memory script is, I do have to pass in an access token. So let's see if I still have that token defined. I do. So I can do memory sh token Micronaut. And you'll see there it starts 53, 63, 67. After 10 requests, we can do Quarkus. 52 megs after 10 requests. Spring Boot, 88, and Helidon, 94. So Helidon got a lot better. It used to be up like 120, so that's pretty cool. And then the other Docker commands, if we were to look at start Docker, you'll see it, up at the top here. I actually got it from Micronaut, right? So I just wanted to show you that. And then the memory one, I'm actually running it. Didn't mean to do that. Cat memory Docker. It's just, pinging that 10 times basically, right? So it expects it to be running. And there's also the start Docker. So if I run that, it's like you need to specify like mrabel Quarkus, and it actually won't work on this Mac because Linux AMD, right? So in production, you're going to want to build Linux images, not M1 images, unless you do want to run on Apple Silicon in production. So to solve that and show that that works, there's this cool thing I recently discovered from Daniel Hinosa, Gitpod.io. So Gitpod will allow you to actually open up like a project, a GitHub project, and it has Homebrew installed. It has SDKman installed. It's even got Java installed. I think by default it's Java 11. I wish it was 17, but it's 11. And it's got Docker support. So you can actually open all of these, right, with this Docker Compose, where I have all of them specified running on different ports. And I could just do Docker Compose up, and it'll basically download them all, pull them from my, Docker hub and run them. And it'll expose the ports. So I just want to show you that working real quick, unless this takes too long. So it'll prompt you to make them public, right? So we have all 4 of them running on different ports. And then you can look at the ports here, and we could copy like the Micronaut one here, or open it up, and then we could set it as a URL locally, service equals, and specify hello, and then HTTP service, and look at that. So we're talking to them running in Gitpod, and works great. So now back to the presentation. Let me unmirror, press play. So now's when I like to do a fun comparison of the communities and the ecosystems. And I want you to take these with a grain of salt, because guess what? Spring Boot has been around since April 1st, 2014. Yes, they were bold and released on April Fool's Day. Maybe they were trying to copy Gmail, but that was 10 years ago. Micronaut 1.0 came out in October 2018. All right, so that was 6 years ago. Quarkus, November 5th, 2019, 5 years ago. And Helidon was February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2019. And so Spring Boot's been around for a whole lot longer. So when you look at Stack Overflow, yes, most people have a problem with Spring Boot. You could say that, but you could also say it's a sign of community, right? And a lot of people are using Spring Boot, therefore asking questions. I do believe it used to be mailing lists. Now it's Stack Overflow. GitHub stars, a lot more people starring Spring Boot. And I just did these stats 2 weeks ago or 20 days ago, right? Since then, Micronaut hasn't gone up at all. Quarkus has gone up 100, and Spring Boot has gone up 200, and Helidon hasn't gone up at all. So you can see the growth is still happening within Spring Boot. And if you look at the star growth, holy cow, right? Like Spring Boot still has more of an upward trajectory than the others. Jobs on Indeed. If you're new to Java and you want to learn a framework that'll get you a job, Spring Boot it is. The fun thing about this is you might be thinking MicroProfile will get you a job. No, there's only 3 in the whole US. But Java in general, 38,000. JavaScript, only 33,000. So we got them by 5,000 there. And then Kotlin, 1,700. So Java is still king, has the most jobs, and Spring Boot has a bunch. For Twitter followers, you might want to call it X. I do not want to call it X. I'm going to keep calling it Twitter. So Micronaut just in the last, 2 weeks is up 100. Quarkus is up 100. Spring Boot was up 300, and Helidon was up 50. And then I'm a big JHipster fan and supporter. So we have Spring Boot as our default. JHipster is now available. JHipster 8 is available. We also have a Micronaut blueprint, and we have a Quarkus blueprint. So if you want to use JHipster with any of these, you can. There was a Helidon blueprint started in 2021, but it never proceeded from there. There is a GitHub repo. If you're interested, I could give that to you. So whenever I do this presentation, I always seem to find something, right? And even if it was 2 weeks ago, like something changed between then. So when I first started testing these Docker containers on EC2, the Quarkus guys were very nice in helping me get everything up and running. But then a month later, when I came and tried to do the timings again, I found that I was actually using the old container. So what I found is I had to forcibly remove the Docker containers to get a new version. So the Docker RMI image ID -- force helped me do that. It's weird that the optimized Micronaut app starts slower than the non-optimized one. I believe when I was doing Micronaut 3, that wasn't the case. So that's new. The Spring Boot 3.2.1 and 3.2.2 doesn't work with GraalVM when using Web Plus security, is unfortunate. February 19th. Hope it'll be fixed. Helidon performs better than Spring Boot for the first time, both in startup time and memory usage. And the frameworks are filthy liars when it comes to printed startup time. So it's crazy that I got away with, not doing the scripted version for the first year or two of doing this presentation. So my thoughts are Quarkus provides the best developer joy and memory usage. A lot of that's because their console, when you start it up, allows you to do debugging. It has a dev UI that you can go and configure the different components, including like Auth0 or Keycloak. And it's just kind of a joy because you're not used to that in Java where, everything reloads without you actually touching anything. Like even with Spring Boot, you have to compile the class to get Spring Boot dev tools to restart. Micronaut is consistently competitive with Quarkus. Like they might do a new release next week and it'll be faster in both, in startup time. Usually not memory usage. Quarkus usually wins that one. Spring Boot has the strongest community, ecosystem, and growth to this day. So even though these new frameworks have come out, they haven't really caught Spring Boot. The other thing that I don't have on here anymore, because I don't want to rag on the Spring guys too much, Spring Boot 3 was supposed to make it so they didn't have as much runtime reflection and basically be faster. At least my expectation was they would be as fast or faster than Micronaut and Quarkus. That didn't happen. You can see it's still like twice as long to start up and twice the memory usage. But Helidon is competitive with Spring Boot, just not very popular. I imagine that a lot of those stars and a lot of those, other things are from the Oracle employees themselves. So my action recommendation to you is if you're new to Java, try Spring Boot. If you know Spring Boot and you want to trial one of these, faster frameworks for your serverless needs, try, their migration path. So both Quarkus and Micronaut have ways of, leveraging your Spring Boot knowledge with those frameworks. In some cases, I believe the imports might even be the same. Testing is important, even though I said no one tests. I lied. Invest early and often because it'll really help you maintain your app over the years. Design your apps with security in mind. Use an OpenID Connect in OAuth 2.1 because they're standards and you can switch between identity providers and use someone else or Keycloak if you want. And on our Okta or our Auth0 Developer Center, that's at first link, developer.auth0.com. We have a bunch of tutorials for doing a resource server, for doing OIDC authentication, and for doing RBAC, role-based access control, with Spring Boot, with Quarkus, and with Micronaut. And our Okta Dev handle, you can find us on GitHub, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you want to make login our problem, not yours, you can use Auth0 for free, 7,500 monthly active users. We have passkey support, so you don't need to use passwords anymore. As of like yesterday, it's supported in Firefox, so all the major browsers have passkey support. You can use that QR code to sign up there. No credit card required. And subscribe to our Zero Index newsletter. The reason I recommend this is because me and my buddy Deepu make up the Java team on the Auth0 developer relations team. And if you sign up here, we get credit. And so we like to beat, the JavaScript team and the Python team and stuff like that. You can unsubscribe next week. Just subscribe today and then we'll get points. And of course, use the source. You can see the URL for the example I showed and open it up in Gitpod and try it out. The difference is those URIs, right? The issue or URI or the JWKS URI is pointing to my Auth0 instance. So you won't be able to generate an access token for it, but you could easily change it to your own. And in that README, it'll show you how to do that. So finally, may the auth be with you. And you can connect with me on my website, rabeldesigns.com, on Twitter. That's also my LinkedIn and my GitHub at mrabel there. This presentation has already been uploaded to SpeakerDeck, so you can check it out there. And most of the code I write these days is on Octadev. So now we'll take any questions. Oh, I can't hear you. Nope.
All right, this should be better now, right? All right,
Yep.
sorry. Yeah, Yeah, I learned tons of things, Matt. This was great. First of all, that PKCE is pronounced Pixie. This was interesting. I had no idea about it. This was really cool. Good stuff. So there is yeah, folks say thank you, awesome talk in the comments there, and I hope there will be a few more questions. There was one question, and that's like a tough one. You're not softball here. So Philip asks, let us know whether the financial industries should adopt Micronaut rather than Spring Boot. It won't be an easy ask.
Well, I think for financial industry, right, they want to be the most secure. But I think it's interesting, for instance, for me using my bank, right? I'm not going to tell you which bank, but their login mechanism is terrible. And I think this happens with a lot of banks where they aren't actually using OAuth or OpenID Connect, and they don't allow you to use like social login. If your bank does, like, let me know, maybe I'll switch. But I think they're the most resistant to like new things, right? I don't see financial institutions like adopting passkeys soon, but they should, because that's more secure than passwords, right? Someone can get your password and log in from somewhere else, versus a passkey has to be on the browser that you created it on. And so I think, there's one perspective, which is, in the financial industry, use the one that's not as popular because it doesn't have as many people using it, and maybe it hasn't had as many security vulnerabilities discovered. But I do think the more popular one probably has more security vulnerabilities discovered, and they might exist in the less popular ones. They just haven't been found because no one's targeting those,
Right. Okay. Yeah, I see. That makes sense. What else? Yeah, people, please bring on your questions. I'm curious, in the meantime, while folks hopefully have some more. So I saw you did this memory test by running those requests like 10 times. And I was wondering, have you also explored it like longer? Because I would expect, for instance, like the JIT compiler to take a bit longer to kick in if you're on the JVM, right? Not on in native. So I was wondering, so if you do like, 20K, 50K requests, so it reaches some sort of a steady state, whether you also looked into that.
Right. It's something that I haven't done, but I plan to do it for next week's presentation at JFocus, because that talk is titled Reactive Frameworks for the Win, because we've been given all this hype about reactive frameworks for the last 10 years or so. And, we've been told they're better, but now with virtual threads, like, are they better? So I don't expect I'm going to have all the answers like next week, right? Because I've just started like doing performance testing, but as that is one of the things I want to do is like, how long does it take for it to fall over? Like, how many requests per second does the framework fall over? And, let's take 3 versions of Spring Boot, the regular one with Spring MVC, the one with virtual threads enabled, and then one with Webflux, right?
Okay.
And I think, I don't know if the reactive stuff is relevant when you get to the native version, right? So that's something that I need to learn more about. I don't know if I'll learn it by next week, but I think a lot of what people want to know is just on the JVM, right? Those 3 kind of things, which one performs better. And even though my example is really simple, right, I think it does have security in there. It is doing some processing, and it's not talking to a database, but it's still doing something. And I think, that is where I do want to use something like Hydrofoil, I think was recommended.
Yeah.
And just see how long it takes to fall down.
Absolutely, yeah. Hydrofoil is great. I mean, I've been with Red Hat, so I might be biased, but yeah, it's great if you want to do this real world kind of use case scenario where, I don't know, you want to put 3 items in your basket, then do another kind of request, and like simulate those real requests, and then have 100 users doing those workflows at the same time, and you can see how many of those users can you sustain at the same time. There's a bit of a learning curve, I would say, but it's definitely worth checking out. Absolutely.
Well, and the other thing I'm not doing is all my tests on the M1 or on EC2 are happening on the same machine, right? And so to be truly testing the serverless aspect and the startup aspect, you would have to deploy it to a serverless environment and then hit it from a different machine and somehow try to get those numbers and how long it takes,
Right. Okay. And I'm wondering, I mean, whether you can, I don't know whether you can talk to it, but are you using any of those frameworks at Okta internally?
At Okta, yes, Spring Boot, the whole workforce identity stack is built on Spring Boot.
Okay, I see. So you got to move them to
And on the Auth0 side, it's actually Node.js and Hoppy, right? So
oh my goodness.
I've been fighting an uphill battle since I got to Auth0 or joined that team to be like, no, we're going to make Java developers love us, right? Because
Right.
there's a lot of JavaScript developers that love them, but the Java community hasn't known about them that much.
Right. Okay, I see. I'm just gonna ask any more questions for Matt. I know maybe folks want to go to the next talk already. Yeah, let's give it a second or two. But this was great again. I'm really excited to have seen this. Yeah, Eric says Hyperfold definitely has a learning curve. But yeah, I think it's time well spent. Also it's well designed. It isn't subject like to this coordinated omission problem you have with some other benchmarking frameworks. So definitely a good thing to check out. Cool. I mean, you're available online, right? So people can find you there, and I suppose hit you up with questions there. Again, thank you so much. This was a great session, and everybody, thank you for being here. Thanks for being at the Java Champions Conference. I think there's one other talk, so make sure you don't miss this one. And then, of course, everything is on YouTube. Matt's session is on YouTube. All the other sessions are on YouTube. And have a wonderful rest of your day. See you.
Cheers.